Well, good afternoon. Really wonderful to be with you this afternoon. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's great to see so many of our students and faculty here with us in person in the International Affairs building. Today's discussion is really to inaugurate a new program, Emerging Voices in National Security and Intelligence, that has recently been launched by SIPA's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. You know, this new program builds on Saltzman's long and distinguished history of scholarship in international relations and security, but it is also aiming very deliberately to encourage a new generation of leaders, particularly women, Indigenous, students of color, and first-generation students to consider and pursue careers in national security and intelligence. We're very honored to have Michèle Flournoy with us to deliver our first public address under this new program. She brings unique and deeply informed perspectives to the discussion as former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, among other senior roles in government, and as chair and former CEO of the Center for a New American Security. So thank you very, very much for being with us today. She will be speaking on contemporary global security challenges, and the discussion that follows will be moderated by senior research scholar Peter Clement. So thank you for that. Later in the program, we'll also have an opportunity to welcome Carmen Medina, former Deputy Director of Intelligence at the CIA, for a discussion on diversity in national security, operationalizing change. Now, SIPA has long been a center of research, convening, and training around international relations and security and intelligence, and I'm really very, very pleased that in recent years we have been able to strengthen our faculty in this area and indeed have brought on a number of new faculty, including Professors Keren Yarhi-Milo, who now heads the Saltzman Institute, Stephen Biddle, a great scholar of international relations and conflict, who now directs our international security program, Tom Christensen, a leading scholar of international relations and China, who will soon be interim dean of SIPA, Tamar Mitz, a scholar who works on data science and policy questions around security issues, and a number of senior research scholars focusing on cyber conflict and policy, such as Jason Healy and Greg Rattray, joining other scholars and research scholars at SIPA and Saltzman. We also inaugurated our Kent program in conflict resolution, headed by Professor Jean-Marie Janow. So whether studying regional conflicts, geopolitical, political psychology, cyber, intelligence, or other areas, SIPA aims and the Saltzman Institute aims at being really an important hub of learning, convening, training, and engagement. And this new program enhances this in important ways for the future. So before we begin, I want to just take a moment to particularly recognize and thank Mila Tuttle, the sponsor of this new program, for your generosity and your deep commitment to SIPA and Columbia University, and for making the Emerging Voices in National Security and Intelligence really a program that's now possible here. Mila is a graduate of Columbia College and also SIPA, where she studied international security policy, and is currently a producer and a series host of Future Hindsight, a weekly podcast that aims to spark civic engagement through in-depth conversations with citizen change makers. Thank you, Mila, for being here today and for all that you have done for SIPA and for Columbia University. How about a quick applause? Thank you. Really, really delighted. This is an important initiative, and I think it's going to blossom here. And part of the reason it will is because of our new director of the Saltzman Institute. You called the new director for at least a year. You get that, Professor Keren Yarhi-Milo, who's director of the Institute and the Arnold Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies. Keren is a leading scholar of international relations and foreign policy with a particular focus on international security, and informally we often speak of her as really a scholar in the tradition of our own great Robert Jervis in political psychology. Her latest book, Who Fights for Reputation? The Psychology of Leaders in International Conflict, received the Best Book Award on Foreign Policy from the American Political Science Association in 2019, which is an amazing accomplishment, Keren. So thank you for your leadership of the Saltzman Institute, for really helping working with Mila to conceptualize and advance this new program, and for the energy and expertise that you are bringing to SIPA and Columbia University. Keren.
Great to see you all. Thank you, Dean Janow, for the relentless support of the Institute and this program. Part of your legacy as the Dean of SIPA is the great effort and resources you've put into building this incredible group of international security scholars and practitioners. We will miss your leadership, but we know that we are in the great hands of the interim dean, Tom Christensen, a dear colleague who I've had the privilege of working with since my days at Princeton, and one of the reasons that I wanted to come to SIPA to begin with. Thank you, Merit. Today, I must say, is a particularly emotional and important day for me personally and for the Saltzman Institute in large. Today, we're celebrating the first of several launch events of the Emerging Voices program in Intelligence and National Security, a program that focuses on giving students theoretical knowledge as well as practical and analytical skills to learn about the world of national security and intelligence so that they can decide for themselves whether this field is right for them. It's also a program that seeks to identify and mentor women and underrepresented groups in this area of study and practice. While we believe that this field has come a long way, and our speakers today, Michèle Flournoy and Carmen Medina, are two great examples of powerful and brilliant figures, we still need to ensure that the pipeline of young, talented, knowledgeable, and passionate students is robust, especially when it comes to women and underrepresented groups. Cultivating this next generation of deep and diverse thinkers is something that requires investing in early exposure, education, and mentorship. And we believe that we can do it well here at Columbia. So starting this year, we're adding 4 new courses on contemporary issues in intelligence and national security, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. We will host our first postdoc fellow specializing in this field of study. We're bringing in speakers and hosting panels, workshops, and conferences focused on both the current national security landscape as well as professional development. We're greatly expanding paid research opportunities for promising students interested in these subjects. Finally, more than ever, we are reaching to students across the universities at both the undergraduate and grad level, trying to foster a sense of a supportive intellectual community. It has been already remarkable to feel the energy those students are bringing to Saltzman Institute, and this is just the beginning. I've had this vision for this program for a long time. As someone who served at the IDF intelligence and still thinks those were probably the most fascinating years of my professional career, as someone who sat exactly where you're sitting today, as a Columbia student 20 years ago, learning about the academic discipline of intelligence from 2 of the leading scholars in the field, our own Robert Jervis and Richard Betts. As someone who chose a career in academia, writing and teaching on issues of intelligence and foreign policy, and maybe most importantly, as a woman who directs an academic institute in security studies, something that is still unfortunately very rare today. Wearing all of these hats, I can tell you that this is something I'm very passionate about. But being passionate about something is not enough. We at the Saltzman Institute were incredibly lucky that Mila Tuttle read an interview in which I discussed these issues and ideas and decided to pick up the phone and say, I want to help you do that. Seriously, how rare is that? We cannot be more grateful for Mila's generosity. She's been an incredible partner in this. Her passion for the cause, her kindness, her ability to help us find solutions to problems and spread the word about this program. Really, we cannot overstate how meaningful and fun it has all been. We literally could not have launched this program without you, so thank you very much. I would like to also thank our crew at Saltzman for their incredible work and dedication, especially Ingrid Gersman, the Institute's Assistant Director, Peter Clement, our Program Director, who you will hear from shortly, the Executive Committee of the Saltzman Institute, and last but not least, our amazing, talented Saltzman student staff in Bar, Haley, Olivia, Michael, and Courtney. Thank you for putting this together. Now, before I introduce Mila to say a few words, I would like to show you a brief video, our student staff, and here a shout out to Haley, who worked on this with VidMob Gives to show you a taste of what this program is all about. Courtney? Thank you very much. Now I have the pleasure and honor to introduce to you Mila Tuttle, the program sponsor. As Mary said, Mila is an independent international affairs professional. She graduated from Columbia College with a bachelor's degree in history and from the School of International Public Affairs with a master's degree in international security policy. After a career in Wall Street, she launched Future Hindsight, a podcast which she hosts and produces that is focused on increasing civic engagement by interviewing experts and activists. Mila also serves as the president of the board of directors of The Kitchen and is a member of the board of directors of the Columbia College Alumni Association. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your support. The floor is yours.
Wow, those were very, very generous introductions by both Dean Janow and by Keren. Thank you very much. It's a beautiful day here in New York, which is why we love to live here. It's wonderful to be back on campus. This is one of my favorite spots on the planet. Well, I'm just so excited to be here today on the first of several inaugural events for the emerging voices in national security and intelligence at the Arnold Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. So as just mentioned, I host a podcast on civic engagement called Future Hindsight, and we are about to drop a new season on the social contract. And so I've been thinking a lot about how we live, what we owe each other, and asking big questions about the obligations of power, what we can demand from the state, how we can renegotiate a social contract to repair what's broken or maybe has never worked, and to reimagine a social contract for today and for the future. And in that context, of course, it matters quite a lot what we do in matters of national security and intelligence, how we wage war, and how we negotiate peace. So there can be no doubt that to accomplish a more peaceful world, and dare I say, world peace, we must necessarily include more women and more diverse voices from all pockets of this planet to be at the table and in the rooms where decisions are made. Their perspectives and lived experiences are essential to bring forth a world at peace. And that is what the emerging voices in national security and intelligence is all about. I just read this interesting statistic that the increases in productivity in the United States, 20 to 40% of the increases in productivity in the United States economy between 1960 and 2010 can be attributed to diversifying the workforce, which is to say, adding many, many more women and many, many more people of color to the workforce. I think that's an astounding statistic, and I think when you put it like that, it puts into perspective exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. And personally, as a woman and a mother, I'd like to add this funny anecdote from Reese Witherspoon, just to lighten the mood. She said, any child knows that if you want to get something done, you're not going to ask your father. You're going to ask your mother. So all this to say, when we are more inclusive, we can find the best people and the best ideas. I'm thrilled to be a part of this initiative, and I'm super thrilled that Keren is at the helm of this effort. My deep wish is for us to look at this moment from a future time and see that this is the turning point in the ascent of women and more people of color into leadership positions in national security and intelligence. I know that we can do this together, and this is just the beginning. Thank you very much.
All right, so now let me just introduce our Peter Clement, our director of the new program, and he will introduce the speakers for today. In addition to being the director of this new program, Peter Clement is a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at SIPA. Prior to coming to SIPA, he had a real illustrious government career in intelligence and national security, and I will just summarize it briefly. He held several senior analytical and management positions in the CIA, the most recent of which was Deputy Assistant Director of CIA for Europe and Eurasia. His prior positions included 8 years as Deputy Director for Intelligence for Analytic Programs, the Director of the Office of Russian and Eurasian Analysis. Peter also served as a PDB, a daily briefer for Vice President Cheney, NSC advisor Condoleezza Rice, and Deputy NSC advisor Hadley in 2003-2004, and did a brief tour at the National Security Council as a director for Russia and later as a senior CIA representative to the U.S. mission in the United Nations. As expert in the field of intelligence, Peter has been instrumental in turning this idea for the program into a reality. We are very thankful and grateful for all of his help and hard work. This event could not have been possible without him. Thank you, Peter. And please, if you can come and introduce the speakers for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Keren. Thank you, Mila. Thank you, Dean Janow. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about this for a lot of reasons. A big part of which are today's speakers. I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time at meetings with Michèle Flournoy. She's amazing. I also spent many, many years working with Carmen, and I know her quite well, and I'm excited to hear the both of them speak today. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce Michèle Flournoy. You will have a program. There's a longer bio profile there. I'm going to try to hit the career highlights. I feel like I'm at a PDB briefing here, by the way. It's like boom, boom, boom. Let me get those points. So Michèle served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012. She was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations. She also led the development of DoD's 2012 strategic guidance. In the mid-1990s, she served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Threat Reduction and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. Michèle presently is the co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors and a co-founder and now chair of the Center for New American Security. She has been the recipient of many awards and honors, notably the American Red Cross Exceptional Service Award, 3 Department of Defense Medals for Distinguished Public Service, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Joint Distinguished Civilian Service Award, and CARE's Global Peace, Development, and Security Award. She's edited several books, authored dozens of articles. If you watch TV at all, you may have seen her on CNN, ABC, NBC, BBC, PBS, and one of my favorites, NPR. Michèle serves on several boards, including the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group. She served on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, CIA's External Advisory Board, and the Defense Policy Board. Michèle holds a bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University and a master's degree in international relations from Balliol College at Oxford University. Michèle, over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And I just want to add my words of congratulations to SIPA and to Columbia for starting this Emerging Voices series. We're at a critical juncture in our national security, and we need to pull from all of the talent, the best talent that's available in the country. My own view is that in a democracy, you want a national security cadre that looks like America. And all of the literature, the business literature tells us that when you include a greater diversity of voices at the decision-making table, you get better performance and you get better results. So kudos to you for launching this initiative, and very excited to see where it goes. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes to set the table for our fireside chat and Q&A, just by describing how I see the strategic environment at the moment and some of the key strategy moves we need to make to deal with it. So, you all are coming into this field or studying this field at a historic inflection point. We really are coming to the end of a 20-year period where our focus was principally on the post 9/11 issues and conflicts, dealing with terrorism around the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth. But what's happening now geopolitically is a major resetting of the table, with a rising China that is on the path to become the dominant economic power in the world in the future, and is also contesting US influence in terms of who writes or who has greatest influence over the rules of the road in the international order. So we're at a key inflection point, particularly with China, but also with a revisionist Russia that is challenging democracy, challenging our interests and norms around the world, and a proliferation of other threats, whether it's Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, North Korea's nuclear arsenal, and many others. Including some existential threats, climate change being number one among them. And we have got to start thinking about and treating climate change as a national security issue, in addition to being an environmental and economic issue. We also have, as we just saw recently with the potential Chinese tests, well, we don't know exactly what happened, but the forms of that nuclear arsenals are taking are changing, which may pose some very real and new challenges to crisis stability, strategic stability, along with new capabilities in cyber and space. So there's just no shortage of challenges on the geopolitical agenda right now. And we need fresh thinking, new thinking, not constrained by the paradigms of the last 20 years to really grapple with these successfully. At the same time, the other feature of the environment that I think is really important to note is that while all these tectonic shifts are happening geopolitically, we're also in a period of profound technological disruption. Whether it's the rise of AI, autonomy, robotics, new synthetic bio, quantum computing, 6G, hypersonics. I mean, the list goes on, where you have these technologies that are certainly, many of which will change our societies, but all of which will also change how we approach national defense, how we approach deterrence, how we operate militarily to defend our interests and allies. So we need people who really can bridge the gap between these emerging technologies and what it means for national security. So that's another really important feature of the current environment. So in the face of that, what should we be doing? What are we doing? I actually think that I'm not speaking for the Biden administration. I'm not championing them, but I do want to say that I think there are three key elements of strategy, the beginnings of a strategy that they have right on this. And, I may have some differences here and there, but I wanted to outline three pillars that I think are really important to deal with the environment I've just described. Number one is that we have to reinvest in the drivers of our own competitiveness here at home. Our domestic cohesion, our economic performance, our resilience as a nation, as a democracy, is the foundation on which we build our national security and our influence abroad. And so investing in science and technology, research and development, more equitable access to higher education, smart immigration policy that actually tries to attract and then keep the best and brightest from around the world. I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, half of the founders are either immigrants from other countries who decided to, bring their innovation and their entrepreneurship to the United States as citizens, or first-generation Americans. So that immigration flow is critical to who we are and to our vibrancy as a society, but also as an engine of innovation. So there's a lot of work we need to do domestically to turn the corner on COVID, get Americans back to work, invest in the jobs of the future, in the digital economy and clean energy and so forth, and to really rebuild our societal cohesion, to kind of rebuild consensus around some of the core elements of the strategy we need to go forward with in national security. The second pillar is we are so much stronger when we act in concert and arm in arm with like-minded states. So after a rough 4 years, frankly, under the previous administration, and I say that as a practitioner, not as a partisan, we have a period where we've got to reinvest and revitalize and re-energize our alliances and partnerships. This is a unique source of American advantage. China doesn't have alliances. Russia doesn't have alliances. We are unique in our ability to bring like-minded states together and work on the toughest problems together, from climate change to non-proliferation to deterring war. And I think, the Biden administration has made a good faith effort to really invest in those relationships. You see the operationalization of the Quad, for example, US, Japan, Australia, India dialogue. You see other investments. I think they've had some stumbles. The handling of how Afghanistan withdrawal was executed, I think, created some issues. And so it's not a perfect track record, but I think the impetus, the desire to focus on those alliances and to get them to be more operational. Can we find clusters of allies who want to work in a given technology area together to try to set norms that are consistent with our democratic values, as opposed to the authoritarian approach of a China or Russia, who, if we don't show up, may end up setting the standards for the world. And then the last key pillar is we really need to remake and re-engineer, I think, some of the tools, our toolkit for national security. And let me explain what that means. I've spent a career in and out of the Defense Department, and I personally like, to have a strong investment of defense to be able to deter and prevent conflict. But too often we've invested very heavily in defense and then put everything else on life support, whether it was the State Department or AID or other instruments, non-military instruments of our power. We have to invest more in those diplomatic instruments. In today's world, we need a digital successor to the US Information Agency, which was dismantled under the Clinton administration. There are, in a world of cyber and space, we've got to think about tools differently. So there's just some updating and upgrading of our tools that we need to really be present and deal with these challenges effectively. And then there's a people dimension of that. I mean, part of it is rebuilding the cadre of experts in the intelligence community, particularly in the civil service and in the foreign service, because frankly, you had a lot of people voting with their feet over the last many years, and we've lost a lot of the natural emerging leaders, particularly in the civilian side of things, State Department and the intel community. And you know, I was told that more than 100 ambassador rank foreign service officers left over the last 4 years or so. So we have some human capital rebuilding to do. But I also think, to the point of this whole initiative, we've got to take a much more systematic approach to cultivating a robust and diverse national security talent pipeline. And you cannot find a better expert on how to do this than Carmen. So I'm thrilled that she's going to be speaking to you as well. But it takes time and it takes effort. It takes time. You know, if you look at some of the women leaders who've now emerged in the Department of Defense, which I am so excited about and so proud of them, people like Kathleen Hicks, who's now the first confirmed woman deputy secretary, people like Christine Warmoth, who's now the first female Secretary of the Army. 30 years ago, they were interns. I hired them in my office. And I'm not taking full credit for them because they deserve their own credit. But I'm saying it took 30 years to get from a presidential management intern to being at the level they are now. So it takes painstaking, and it took mentorship. It took sponsorship. It took ensuring that they had seats at the table and progressive leadership opportunities throughout their career to get where they want to go. And that takes deliberate leadership to sustain that kind of effort. We need to do that for women. We need to do it for people of color and others who are underrepresented communities in our national security space. But we also need to take a very systematic look at what are the obstacles. You know, one of the projects that Carmen and I worked on when she was at CIA and I was on the external advisory board, was CIA was doing a really great job of recruiting a very representative entry-level class each year. So, you know, half women, very representative numbers in terms of ethnic and racial and other characteristics. But if you fast forwarded 10, 12, 13 years ahead, and you looked at, okay, who had gone through all the ranks and is now in the promotion pool to their senior intelligence service, which is like their senior executive cadre, their leadership cadre. Those numbers for women and minorities had dropped dramatically. So we were losing somewhere on the journey, we were losing people. And that was the question. What are they experiencing that is causing that? You know, is it a lack of mentorship? Is it a lack of sponsorship? Is it work-life balance issues? Is it, you know, internal networks that sort of trump sort of objective performance evaluation? Or is there bias in the system in various places? And we did a study that really diagnosed the issues end to end. And then, to John Brennan's credit, he was director at the time with a lot of help from Carmen and her team. They went after trying to correct as many of these issues as possible. But it's that, I just use that as an example that it's not enough for a leader to talk about this. That's important, that's a start, but you really have to focus management at time and attention on going after the obstacles and empowering people to really do their best work and stay in the field. And I'm hopeful that, you know, one of the things that this moment is doing is not only raising awareness, but raising accountability for leaders on this issue. So let me stop there. We can talk about anything you want, whether it's broader international environment and particular challenges, or more the human capital side and the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion in the field. Happy to go in any direction you like with the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michèle. I'm going to turn to the audience. I'd like to do moderator's prerogative, but I'm not going to, because I suspect there are a lot of questions out here. So please feel free. I can see people's hands better up here at this higher elevation. Surely we don't have a shy audience here at SEPA. Yes, Professor Biddle.
Need a mic, or should I just speak loudly?
It's in the ceiling above you. You'll be heard.
Speak to the ceiling. So, Michèle, you've been an important voice in diversity issues, and especially in bringing more women into national security. You've also been an important voice in a civil public square in which something approximating a bipartisan conversation can take place. You played a central role in the foundation of the Center for New American Security, which has this interesting role in the current debate as being one of the shrinking number of places where people from different parts of the ideological spectrum have a role, have a voice, can interact with each other to produce findings. I'm curious what lessons you see from your experience founding and then nurturing this institution, CNAS, for the broader question of how do we get a meaningful public conversation on national security issues that isn't as hyper-polarized as the rest of the American public square today.
Yeah, Steve, great to hear your voice. And it's a great, really important question because, we have to be able to create that more sane dialogue if we're going to be able to tackle some of these challenges that I outlined and bring the American people along with us and ensure we have their support in doing that. Building bipartisan consensus isn't just, a nice thing to do. It's essential to sustaining policies across administrations. And most of our policies, whether it's dealing with climate or deterring China or dealing with, Iran's nuclear program, it's going to take years of effort and multiple administrations. So the more you can build consensus in a bipartisan way, the better off you're going to be in terms of having the impact you're trying to have. So the lesson I learned from, CNAS was we actually, if you want to have a strong civil military dialogue, you actually have to have a strong bipartisan dialogue, because if you create a think tank that is overly partisan, or a space that is overly partisan, the military will not show up for the most part, except for some maybe retired folks on the fringe. But the active duty military will not show up because they do not, rightly so, want to be drawn into politics. So we found that when we wanted to create a safe space for real, honest civil military dialogue, we also had to create a safe space for real bipartisan dialogue. And so that is what we have done to make it clear that we weren't just talking the talk, but walking the walk. It affected our staffing. For many years, we've always had bipartisan leadership. So I'm a known Democrat chairing the board, Richard Fontaine, known Republican, being there as CEO. When I was CEO, Richard was my deputy, so we've always had this pairing of Democrats and Republicans, and that trickles down all the way through the staff. We've also tried to create lots of programming to create a safe space for people to come together and have honest dialogue, whether it's our Next Gen program, which we started years ago and brings people from across the political spectrum and all different kinds of backgrounds. So you have a cadre of young people and then several years of that, with alumni different classes interacting, so that you build a big network of people who are across the aisle, diverse backgrounds, diverse experience, and they talk to each other and they are one another's resources. They are one another's mentors and supporters as they go through their career. And then we've done a lot of work on the Hill trying to create bipartisan safe space. I mean, we found that, outside of the armed services committees or a few of the committees, there really was no space for members to meet with others outside their caucus on critical national security issues. So we started with the veterans in Congress from both Democrat and Republican and independent, and started creating a series of opportunities for them to engage with each other sort of problem-solving approach. So anyway, there are lots of lessons there. It can be done. The farther away you stay out of the media spotlight, the easier it is to do. So there's no temptation to grandstand. But it can be done. And I actually think there is a certain appetite for it in Washington because people are exhausted by the polarization and it's not helping us actually deal with the very real problems we have in front of us.
Please.
Great. Hi, my name is Margaret. I'm a second-year student at Columbia SIPA here in grad school. And in terms of sort of your pillars of recommendations for strategy, how can we as future policymakers address or rejuvenate these partnerships in the face of compounding global issues like migration, climate change, and conflict and things like that in the face of democratic backsliding around the world, such as in places like South Asia? And do you see this as a barrier for cooperation globally?
I do think there's a real threat to democracies around the world. And so in my view, it means that we need to double down with those democracies that really are struggling to stay vibrant or who are committed to staying vibrant and go back to first principles of, how do we see the world, share our threat assessment, our opportunity assessments, where do our interests align, where do, who has what comparative advantage in terms of what they can bring to the table, and to translate this into very real concrete areas of cooperation that we're working together on. And my favorite example right now is technology clusters. So for example, if we want to make sure that internet standards, future 6G standards, digital standards are set in a way that supports open, transparent, democratic societies, as opposed to, the export of sort of police state tools of surveillance, societal surveillance, a la the Chinese model, then we collectively have got to show up at some of these standard setting bodies with a common approach. And that's something that that's just an example of one concrete area where we could do a lot if we got ourselves aligned with our key European and Asian democratic partners and showed up together.
Paige, please.
Thank you so much, Michèle, for this. I don't know if what you can see in the room. This is Paige Fortna. I'm a professor here at Columbia. I've got a idea or comment for this program inspired by something you said, and then a question for you. The idea is picking up on what you were saying at the end about the CIA's effort to look through and see where the pipeline was leaking when you had incoming classes that were very representative, but people not moving up. That seems to me like that would be an amazing thing for us to do a panel or a workshop on, because that's a problem that exists in academia as well. And it's a well-known problem without a lot of well-known solutions. So that's the idea. The question is, I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning about the need to think about climate change as a security threat and not just an environmental problem. I agree with that completely. It's a very different kind of problem and will need very different kinds of responses and solutions than the threats that those of us who worked in international security for a long time the ways that we tend to think about threats from other countries or things like that. So I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about not just whether we need to think about climate change as a security threat, but how we go about doing that, and how do we think about a threat like that and the responses that are needed to it, both intellectually, how do we think about that, but also if you have thoughts on, I'm not sure what the right word is, the infrastructure or the sort of human, where should these conversations be happening? Who should be in them? How should they be structured to get us out of a kind of, traditional way of thinking about security threats and allow the kind of thinking that needs to happen on this to happen?
Well, Paige, thanks for the question. And I endorse your suggestion for research too. So in terms of how to think about climate as a national security issue, I sort of think of it in at least two ways. I'm sure there are others. One is climate as a driver of instability and conflict in the future. We certainly understand that more frequent and severe weather events are going to create more numerous and more significant natural disasters and create a demand on militaries and national resources for disaster response around the world. We're already starting to see that, and that's going to continue. So that there's a mission demand piece of that. Not that the military always responds, but in the worst cases where civilian capacity is overwhelmed, it's often asked to help. But more fundamentally, if we were to project out the implications of climate change, you could start to identify the parts of the world that are going to, where resource scarcity could become very destabilizing, whether it's access to clean water, dramatic reduction in arable land and food supply, and so forth. You can almost plot where climate will be an accelerant for resource conflicts in the future. I think if you have that foresight, then making the investments now to start thinking about how can we help prevent those conflicts? What can we be doing now in the next decade or more to actually reduce the risk of conflict and either through mitigation or adaptation, reduce those risks? I think that's very important. The second thing is, what does it mean for our national security apparatus? And again, coming from a DoD background, I'll just give you an example. DoD is just updating a study looking at the impact of climate on all of our coastal facilities around the world. And most US Navy bases will be underwater. Most Marine Corps bases on the littorals will be underwater. So that's a huge infrastructure issue that is going to have to be dealt with if the worst happens. But I do think this is a classic case where you're going to need such a diversity of expertise around the table to wrestle with these issues. And you're going to need to have an integrated kind of whole of government plan for this, that I do think you're going to need a sort of some kind of accountable interagency body, which I know those two things don't always sound like a contradiction in terms, but someone, a White House lead that's running an interagency process on behalf of the president to really coordinate all aspects of the US government climate action and response. Because I don't think if you established an agency, you create another stovepipe that, others might say, oh, great, I don't have to worry about it anymore because now the climate agency will take it on. But, but the truth is every agency is going to have a piece of the solution here.
Michèle, I have a question in the back. Could you identify yourself too?
Yep. Hi. Thank you so much, Michèle. My name is Tendor Dorje. I'm a PhD candidate in the political science department. And my question is about the role of ideology and the new, the dangers posed by the rise of China as a new global power. And thinking about, you mentioned the toolbox or the toolkit. We have military instruments, diplomatic instruments. To what extent should we be thinking about ideological instruments and the role that could play? Because when we look back at the era when US displaced the Great Britain as the main power in the world, I think the idea of self-determination may have played a great role contributing to decolonization and dislodging the UK as the #1 power. And right now, in a way, China is also a colonial empire because you have the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kong, who are pushing for self-determination. And in a way, compared to military instruments, we have diplomatic instruments. The ideological instrument might be one of the things that China is actually very vulnerable to. So to what extent should the national security establishment be thinking about those type of tools?
Yeah, no, I think I have not used the phrase ideological instruments, but I do think there's an ideological element of the competition with China, to be sure. They are putting forward an authoritarian model whose primary objective is keeping the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in power. It's and then I think we have a very compelling alternative to offer in terms of saying we want a rules-based order where not a might makes right order. We want a rules-based order where even the smallest sovereign country has their sovereign rights and is has commitments from the international community and international law to protect those. And so I do think when we show up and we have alternatives to offer, whether it's investments in democracy, investments in entrepreneurs and innovation that can grow markets, free markets in an environment, whether it's approaches to poverty reduction that empower women and girls and create greater equity in societies. I mean, there's a lot that we have to offer that is compelling. I think there are two things right now that we've got to combat. One is China is running around the world with a narrative of US decline. They point to our mishandling initially of COVID. They point to January 6th. They even point on the news to the collapse of the condos in the condo building in Florida. I mean, this is all, examples of the corrupt kind of rot and, chaos of American democracy, and it's all falling apart, and America's down, it has fallen down, and they're not getting up. So the first thing we have to do is we have to demonstrate with that is a false narrative. We are getting up. We are, as we always do in history, kind of rising from the ashes, and we are going to put it back together, and we are going to be there and living up to our own democratic ideals. That is step one. But step two is we've got to show up. We've got to be strategic. We've got to decide, where does it really matter for us to counter this Chinese alternative model? We can't be everywhere, and we can't have our own BRI. We can't have a symmetric response. We need to be strategic and asymmetric. But where it matters, we need to show up with those alternative models, and both from a ideological perspective, but also from a programmatic perspective in terms of willingness to invest in helping to create alternatives to what the Chinese are offering. So it's a very long way of saying, you've got an important point, and we need to figure out how to turn that more into sort of real action on the ground in key countries.
Hi, my name's Catherine Flanagan. I'm a first-year international security policy student at CEPA. My question is to you, as a woman who has achieved success in this field despite systematic bias and pipeline leakage. What advice do you have, woman to woman, for young careers or young professionals about to begin their careers in national security?
First of all, come on in, the water's fine. You're going to experience a better environment than I did. I, for years, was, especially because I was in the nuclear field, priesthood, or, what have you. And, there were no women, basically. And so I was always the only woman in the room, or the only one presenting or on the panel, or what have you. So the good news is it's not going to be as bad for you. But I think believe in yourself and be authentic, be the leader that you are naturally, as opposed to trying to be, something you're not. Find mentors. She's the boss, not the job. The most important decisions I made was picking bosses and finding mentors who could help me along. And without them, I would never have had success. Create opportunities for women to support women, or other underrepresented communities to support each other. I have started a working moms in government kind of tea that I hosted for a number of us who were trying to raise young children while we were being undersecretaries or assistant secretaries or whatever, just as like a support group of trying to juggle it all. Picking a partner who's really going to be there to help you along the way and support your career. And then I would say having the perspective that you can have it all, but not always all at the same time. There are times when, your career is is taking off and you're making sacrifices in other parts of your life. And there are times when the other parts of your life really need you and you need to be in a lower gear on your career. So it's kind of like a sine curve. And in the totality, it can be everything you want it to be, but at any given one moment in time, like my experience, being the best possible undersecretary and the best possible mother was impossible at the same time. I could do it over time, but not in the same moment. Usually there was a pretty direct trade-off there.
Thanks. I think I have time for one more question. Rick?
Hi, ma'am. Army Colonel Rick Turner. I'm the War College Fellow here at the Institute this year. Ma'am, thank you so much for your comments, first of all, but I wanted to see if I could get you to unpack your human capital comment, specifically on mentorship and sponsorship. We hear a lot of senior leaders talk about mentorship, but not often do they talk about sponsorship. I'm certainly a product of great mentors. I believe I spent an hour on the phone last night with a mentor of mine, but we don't hear a lot about sponsorship. And so if I could get you to share a few more comments on that, and also if you might share some comments on the importance of diversity in your mentors as you progress through your career. Thanks, ma'am.
Great questions. Thank you, Carl. So and when I use the terms mentorship and sponsorship, in mentoring, I'm talking about someone who you get to know, who you go to for advice, to brainstorm ideas, to get some guidance and suggestions, and so forth. A sponsor is someone who is proactively helping to put you forward for new opportunities. They're the ones who nominate you for the fellowship, who encourages you, puts your name in for the next big job, who makes the call to the person who's hiring and makes the case for you. It's that active sponsoring of you and your career and your next steps. And there is a big difference. One of the challenges, certainly we saw in the CIA study, but I've seen throughout my time in defense, is that people tend to take a mini-me approach to both mentoring and sponsoring, meaning I want to find that young person who reminds me of my young self. Well, if most of the leadership of an institution is male or Caucasian or whatever the majority is, that means it's almost like a self-perpetuating system, because they're looking for their, versions of their former selves and mentoring and sponsoring other people like them. The thing that was transformative for me, I didn't have many women mentors because there just weren't a lot of women more senior in defense. I had a couple and they were wonderful. But most of my mentors were men who had the foresight to say, we need a more representative group, or just, Michèle's terrific, and the fact that she's a woman is irrelevant. And because I think she's talented, I'm going to invest in her and I'm going to put her forward and I'm going to give her opportunities. I just want to highlight my best example was a fellow named Ted Warner. He was a former Air Force colonel, leading analyst at RAND on the Soviets and all things nuclear, Assistant Secretary of Defense. He was remarkable because back in the late 80s, early 90s, he was actively I wrote a piece and published it, and he called me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Excuse me, who are you?" And sort of adopted me as a mentor because of this piece I wrote. And that started a 10, 12-year relationship where I rose from office director to DASD to PDASD and on under his mentorship and sponsorship. And he did that with a whole host of women, single-handedly. I think he brought more women into the Defense Department in the 1990s than any other individual. So we need people like that, and who are really invested in getting the cadre that should represent America to look like America, and that's how we're going to win on national security in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michèle. I almost hate to cut this off, but I actually have a watch and I'm one of those rigid timekeeper type people since I used to be an academic and go to panels a lot. Michèle, thank you so much. I can't say enough how much we appreciated having you here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we get started for part 2 here? I think we have everybody here. Can you all hear me in the room? Okay. Yes. Okay. Carmen, you can hear me. I can see you. We're all set to go here. I'm particularly delighted to be able to introduce Carmen for a lot of reasons. Carmen is a longtime colleague, many years together in the agency. She's also a very good friend. She's one of the most interesting and challenging people I've ever worked with because she does exactly what she writes about in her work. She's ready to challenge assumptions. She loves to think way out of the box. We had so many great conversations, both as analysts, and I will tell you, we grew up as junior analysts together. I first met Carmen when we would co-author pieces where I was the Soviet foreign policy guy writing about what are the Soviets up to in Africa, and Carmen was writing about South Africa and what are the Soviets doing there and in the general neighborhood of Southern Africa. And Carmen, correct me, did you not also work as an analyst on Lebanon?
I did for 2 years, yes.
I'll bet that was painful.
You know, it was actually the easiest thing I ever did because it was during their civil war. And all you had to do was imagine what was the stupidest thing those people could do.
And they did it.
And they did it.
Oh, God. Well, thanks for that tip. But Carmen, I'll confess, every time I read a story about Lebanon, and Lebanon, if anybody's been following this, it's in one of the worst positions it's been in many, many years, if that's even possible. But I always think of Carmen because she was working on it during a horrendous Civil War period. And all I could think of was I would need little scorecards, like who are the players, how many of them are there, and where are they? And it was just a really complicated story. But I digress. So I'm going to briefly hit some of the highlights of Carmen's career because I want to spend as much time as we can being in the world of Carmen and hearing her talk through the way she thinks about a variety of issues. Is that fair, Carmen?
Okay, Peter, if that's how you want to put it, that's fine.
See? Okay, so Carmen is a retired senior federal executive with 32 years' experience in the intelligence community. She's a recognized national and international expert on intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, diversity of thought, and innovation and entrepreneurship in the public sector. She's co-author of the book Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. She's also noted for her landmark Deloitte University press paper on Diversity's New Frontier, Diversity of Thought and the Future of the Workplace. Her own personal story as a change agent at CIA is featured in the Wharton School Professor Adam Grant's best-selling book, Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World. From 2005 to 2007, Carmen was part of the executive team that led the CIA's analysis directorate.
Peter?
I was going to not say that, but that's the fact. No, actually, it was in my script, but I left the script. I just hate that. So we were junior analysts together, and as I looked back on our career, I always wondered, oh my God, we were kind of young then. Who would know that basically 20 years later, we would actually be running the directorate? Like, I wouldn't have put any money on that. It never even occurred to me I'd actually be at that level because all I ever wanted to do was be an analyst. So it really is kind of a remarkable journey that we had together. I need to finish Carmen's bio, however. Carmen's been a featured speaker on critical thinking, diversity of thought, and entrepreneurship for many audiences, including Fortune 500 companies, major nonprofits, and governments. Most recently, she has spoken at the South by Southwest, that's a great acronym, SXSW, and there's a whole bunch of these in her resume here. She also spoke at the TEDx Mid-Atlantic on surviving as a change agent, another SXSW 2018 on avoiding the mediocrity trap, and on critical thinking in their 2017 gathering. Recently, she's spoken to the Roche Pharmaceuticals Culture Coalition, U.S. Treasury officers on diversity of thought, to the FBI for Hispanic Heritage Month, to Canadian federal senior executives about diversity of thought and rebel thinking, and the California STEM Education Conference. Carmen describes herself as Puerto Rican by birth and Texan by nationality. And Carmen, we're going to get that in the Q&A, you know that, right?
Yeah.
She likes to garden and cook things that she has grown. I've been to her house and she grows amazingly good food.
Well, you know, this is really unfair for you to have such knowledge of me, Peter.
I'm sorry, Carmen.
I feel set up, really. Keep going. Keep going.
So I think I hope I got most of it. If I left something out, Carmen, you should feel free to add. But apart from that, you're ready to launch.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Peter and I have had so many wonderful experiences together. You know, what can I say? Peter is a wonderful colleague. So I'd like to thank everyone there for listening to me. And I want to applaud, as Michèle did, the Saltzman Institute for its new program on emerging voices in national security and intelligence. It's so important. And I also want to thank the supporter. Now I'm going to get her name wrong, but it's Mila Tuttle. Did I get that right? Good. And it's just such a wonderful and perhaps destined thing that you are supporting this. It's fantastic. So I want to say some things about diversity in national security. I have some things to say. And I want to start by talking about my career a little bit and just some moments where this issue of diversity and diversity of thought really came into play. So I'm just going to start with some stories. And lest you think these stories are old, I want to tell you that just a few years ago, I was at CSIS talking about probably about diversity in the intelligence community. And after the event ended, a young Latina woman came up to me and she said, can I ask you some questions? I keep applying for intelligence community and national security jobs. And I get to the interview stage, but I've yet to get one. What am I doing wrong? And then she goes, my mentor, or hopefully not really her mentor, maybe just like an advisor, has told me, and this particular woman had shoulder length, very curly hair. I'm not making this up. The woman told me, my advisor has told me that the next time I go to an interview, I should straighten my hair because that will give me a better chance to be selected for the job. That there's, I guess, something wrong with curly Hispanic hair in the national security community. That was one of the most depressing moments of my of the last 5 years for me to realize that that kind of attitude and advice was being given, but also to accept that there might have been, a point to that advice that actually sadly reflected current reality in the people who are making hiring decisions. So as Peter said, I'm Puerto Rican by birth, Texan by nationality. I just read yesterday that Puerto Rico is leading all US states and territories in its vaccination rate. The highest percentage of people who are fully vaccinated is in Puerto Rico. So I was pretty excited by that. So as Peter said, my first major account was South Africa. And I got to work on it in the 1980s, both as an analyst and as the manager of the team. During this time when the tensions between the blacks and whites in South Africa were coming to a head, apartheid, although people didn't really know it, was in its death throes. And there was a lot of concern in the Reagan administration about how this would all end. And at that time, the Reagan administration supported the white apartheid regime in South Africa because South Africa was an important linchpin against the Soviet advance on the African continent. And I, during my time as an analyst, had begun to believe that there was a possibility for Black majority rule without violent conflict. And I based that view on a couple of things. that blacks, I could see in what was going on in South Africa, and I'm sorry to use terms like blacks and coloreds and whites, which I try to avoid, but unfortunately those were the terms that were used in South Africa. But you could see instances of Africans and whites in South Africa cooperating at the local level to try to resolve just local issues like a garbage worker strike. And I had been following South Africa long enough to know that that kind of conversation had not previously occurred. And I thought it was an indicator of something changing in the mindset of people in South Africa. And I also believe that the whites in South Africa, primarily the Afrikaners, who were really the ones with power, would eventually figure out, as seemed obvious to me, that they could figure out a way to retain economic power and still yield political power, and that was probably their best option at this point. And I remember reading a report during this period of a South African leader who supposedly was speculating on that while he was at a hunting lodge over a glass of brandy. And I remember thinking, that I could feel the emotion of that leader grappling with how do they get themselves out of this conundrum. Most people didn't agree with me. Some did, but most people, I would say the majority of people working on South Africa thought I was wrong. They would point out to two things, and I'm telling you this in some detail because I think there's little indications throughout here of how the lack of diversity affects how people think about issues. My colleagues would say, oh, you know, the blacks are not organized. They have no effective organization in South Africa, and they have no power. All the instruments of power are in the hands of the Afrikaners. And at the time, I didn't really have any effective arguments against that. Although in the 35 years since then, I've learned a lot more about things such as complexity theory and emergence and how those factors come into play in the way societies evolve and change. But anyway, a colleague of mine, eventually I was actually asked to write a personal rebuttal to an important estimate that was being written on South Africa at the time. And actually Bob Gates was the guy who's the director of analysis at the time, commissioned me to do that. And I wrote it and it became kind of famous. And eventually my boss said he needed to go to South Africa to investigate and get some ground truth about the situation there. So he goes off and he comes back. And he actually, to my great surprise, writes a memo to Bob Gates saying, I think Carmen's right. I really see the facts on the ground and in the interviews. I think there's something that she's saying there that has credibility. But this boss was a very full of ego person. And so he actually included a paragraph. And finally, here I come to the point where he said, why didn't I see this at the same time that Carmen did it? Why was I so slow to understand this dynamic? And he actually wrote in the memo, maybe because I'm not Puerto Rican. And I read that at the time and I was stunned by it, because I had up until that moment had never really thought that the fact that I was Puerto Rican, I was born in Puerto Rico, Spanish is my first language, would have had any impact on how I thought about the world. And yet, and frankly, I'm also full of ego and I wanted people to recognize my superior analytic skills, right? So it's kind of a complicated sort of issue there. But over time, I've learned that there is something quite mysterious that goes on cognitively. And that, in fact, he may have had a point that my experience as in a minority culture in the United States, probably with less power than, the people that I went to school with, may have had an impact on how I thought about South Africa. So that's my first story. My second story has to do with my experience in bringing or trying to persuade the CIA that the internet and digital revolution were important events that were going to change the way all knowledge organizations did their work. And poor Peter, he would be in the office with me and I would be going, Peter, this is all going to be different in a few years. And he'd go, yeah. And I really worked hard trying to persuade people that we had to adopt some of these digital technologies. And it wasn't until years later, I have to say, to reflect on my own stupidity, that I realized why nobody at CIA was really endorsing what I had to say. So if you think about it, back then in the early aughts, what was the internet about? It was about transparency, it was kumbaya, everybody would have access to information and all would be better. Now, I ask you, what is the CIA about? It's not about any of those things. It wasn't about any of those things then, and it's not about any of those things really now. So what I didn't understand, what I was doing is I was, by arguing for the importance of digital technologies, I was arguing for a theological change in the organization. And when you are a person and you don't have a position of authority and you're arguing for theological change, it is really, really hard. And you're going to feel very uncomfortable. But, here I was, for whatever reason, a person that embraced digital technology almost from the start, trying to make that argument to an organization that saw it as really an existential threat. Couple more stories. I ended up in leading the strategic assessments group at CIA for a couple of years. And it was a group that was charged with looking over the horizon to kind of see what was coming next. And I remember talking to the analysts at the time when I took over and asking them, okay, talk to me about your methods for looking over the horizon. How do you actually do that? And so they looked at me a little funny, and then they said, well, we keep up with the academics and we read the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I stopped them there and I said, foreign affairs. And I said, well, do you think that's really going to get you the inklings of the really new dynamics? Reading these sort of, establishment sort of publications? Because I was just then becoming aware of this really interesting dynamic with blogs and social media and all these new voices that now had an opportunity to affect how we thought about national security and international relations. And I thought that's where we should be looking for new and different ideas and emerging issues. My final story about me, like Peter, I did finally reach a very senior position at the CIA where I got to sit in on really important meetings. And I remember one of the first times I sat in on one of those meetings, there was a discussion, and I'm looking at my notes because I've worded this very carefully and Peter will understand why. I was at a meeting where there was a discussion of something that the agency was contemplating doing that I didn't think the people at the meeting were adequately considering the possible unintended consequences of what the agency was thinking about doing, which could involve innocent lives. So I was in this meeting. This was the first of those meetings I'd been to. People were talking about that. I had a seat at the table, so I could have said something. But as I looked around the table, I felt, this happens to be my first meeting, but they've been having dozens of these meetings before me. And I think that if I mention my concern about unintended consequences, this will be the last time I'm at this meeting. That was my calculation. I'm not particularly proud of this, and I'll talk about this a little later on, but I didn't say anything. And there you have it. So here, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit more, which is it's one thing to have diverse people and diverse thinking in an organization, but how do these diverse thinkers actually have an impact when they're the minority and are not really as powerful as they should be in the hierarchy? My last story has nothing to do with me, and I'm wondering how many of you have read this. John Mearsheimer, is that how you say it? Has a commentary in the current issue of Foreign Affairs on the inevitable rivalry about the US and China. So I'm just curious, I can see a few people. How many have read this article? I recommend that you read it. It's not that long. And basically, his point is that it's the US's fault that China has become this great rival, because we should have done everything we could in the 1990s not to let China, to prevent China from developing its economy. That's, I'm accurately representing his argument. He said we should have not let it join the WTO. We should have not granted it most favored nation. And I think he has more of a point here. We should have been smarter about technology exports. I think he's got more of a point there. That's the realist position in international relations. And I don't have a problem with him making that argument, but it struck me that in the entire article, unless I missed it, he never talks about the hundreds of millions of Chinese who were able to lift themselves out of poverty because of this economic development in the last 20 years, or the 17-year increase in life expectancy that has occurred in China as a result of this economic development. And I read the article and I was just stunned at the lack of, it's not so much lack of diversity, but it's definitely narrow-mindedness of that argument and the paucity of other values expressed in that argument. All right, that's the realist school. That's been a very prominent sort of ideological framework in the making of US decisions. Frankly, it's a very, I think, prominent framework in how many countries make their decisions, right? What's best for us. And it's very much, I think, the house ideology of the intelligence community, right? I think the intelligence community claims to be objective, but if you kind of did a meta-analysis of it, you would have to concede, I think, that the intelligence community wants it to be a world of enemies. It's just a lot better for the intelligence community and job prospects, right? If it's a world of enemies. And, you know, I'm torn when I talk about this. And I hope that the work of your program will help articulate this in better ways. Because on the one hand, I do realize that it's a world of enemies. But on the other hand, I think that the intelligence community would be more effective and would provide better, more rounded advice to US policymakers if we really concerned ourselves about outcomes and about opportunities, and yes, about risks and threats. In other words, if our frame of reference included positive things and negative things, and not just this idea of adversaries and a world of enemies. And what happens when we think about the world only in terms of enemies is that we, I think, historically overreact, right? In the 80s and 90s, there was the Soviet Union that was our enemy. So we would, you know, use that filter to look at Southern Africa, for example. And during that time, because of our emphasis on this particular adversary, and there always has to be like a numero uno adversary, we tended to overlook terrorism and how it was mesticizing in the world, and particularly the Middle East and South Asia. Then 9/11 happens, and now terrorism is our adversary. And we tend to overlook, certainly the first decade of this century, the emergence of China. And now it's China who's our adversary. And I will bet you anything that there's some important issues that we are overlooking as a result of this adversarial framework dominating the way we think about national security. Just a few more comments, and then I want to talk about this. How do we, what are the lessons I've learned about operationalizing diversity? The ICE and the national security establishment have long needed different thinking. I mean, Michèle talked about that persuasively, but it's not enough to bring different people or different thinking into the community. We also have to find a way for that thinking to actually have an impact and influence decision makers. And I think that that is an important area of study for this institute. I want to take a moment to talk about what are the different axes of diversity, the different vectors and elements of diversity and new voices that we need to inject into the intelligence community. And I, of course, completely agree with the idea that the intelligence community and the national security community need to look like America for any number of reasons and need to look like the world. But let me offer you some other aspects of diversity that we should look at as well. So for example, the national security establishment and the intelligence community are really good examples of male-ordered organizations. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the literature on sort of gender-ordered organization, but basically the idea here is that we think that the organizational structure is neutral, but in fact, the organizational structure, having been created by men, tends to favor the values of men. And I was struck when Michèle was talking about how she created that a support group for senior officials trying to raise children at the same time. And that was an example of how she was trying to place a female value more at the core of what the organization was doing, but she had to do it in a supplementary way. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why aren't these issues of caring for others, for example, inherently a value of the organizations that we work in? And kind of the literature that talks about this is this literature about gender-ordered organizations. So I kind of think that would be an interesting area to look in. I think, and Michèle talked about this, I think the national security and the intelligence community still don't understand the impact that technology, emerging technology, is having on this world, from artificial intelligence to CRISPR technology. And I don't think that we pay, in terms of where we're placing our priorities, we're not paying enough attention to it. And I knew personally way too many senior officials at CIA or in the national security establishment who were proud of the fact that they were technologically ignorant. And it just drove me crazy because they were not coming to grips with what this really meant for the world that we live in. Cyber is, you can think of it as an independent element or a subset of technology. But again, our decision makers tend to be kind of ignorant about cyber issues. And I have to confess, I'm sort of, not as conversant as I should be on cyber. Michèle talked about climate change, dealing with the topic of climate change the same way we deal with other topics in national security. That's something that, until we reach that level, we're really not giving it its due. The emotional impact of the emotional element in decision making. There's a tendency for people who write about national security and international relations to adopt, without thinking, the rational actor model. Oh, well, Putin's calculating this, Putin's calculating that, and Xi is calculating this and that, and, adding up the numbers here. And there tends to be not a lot of discussion of kind of the emotional component of that decision making, and how emotions, and to comment on the book Reputation, which I'm going to have to read. In fact, I just grabbed it to read it, how all of those elements aren't given their due in thinking about how people make decisions, including senior leaders. A couple of other kind of, I'm not sure what to call these, but these are like elements of diversity that have to be considered, is the tendency, back to the rational actor model, for people in national security to think about the world in Newtonian terms and to think about action, reaction, and to think that, oh, all I got to do is pull the right lever and the problem will be solved. That only applies to Newtonian physics. It doesn't apply to other kinds of physics. It doesn't apply to a complex world where there's a lot of emergence and influence by small or less obvious actors. And I think that is something, an area of diversity that has to be studied. I think we need to look at cognitive diversity and the different styles of minds that and how they relate in the national security context. So, for example, the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, recently had a pilot program where they were purposefully looking for neurodiverse talent. For example, people on the autism spectrum, to figure out what are the jobs that they can best do because of that particular cognitive ability. And I suspect that we're just at scratching the surface of understanding cognitive styles, how that leads us to make better sense of reality, and how then that is translated into better decision-making. Another element that I think is understudied in national security right now and needs to be elevated, and it relates very much to this disinformation environment that we're in, is narration. The importance of narratives in the world today. And Michèle talked a lot about the narrative that China is building and how the US has to act to counter it. But the narratives are no longer controlled by governments. They're not the purview of governments. Narratives exist in a free market of information that is both genuine, authentic, and manipulated and disingenuous, right? And that area has to be really understood by national security professionals. And again, I think it is being given short shrift. I think there's a lot there, so I'm just going to stop right now, not in my comments, but on talking about the different elements of diversity. So how do you operationalize diversity? Let's say that you're one of the diverse people that the community is trying to attract, or you are developing expertise in one of these areas that the intelligence community needs to know more about. How do you make your way and have your voice heard? So I've got some ideas. These are all, they're not completely satisfying because they require a certain amount of compromise, nuance, and finesse. So my first is, you have to realize that you are a minority, right? And what that means is that there are going to be barriers to people hearing you, just inherently by definition. So you really need to learn from the experience of others and through mentors to get on, to support Michèle's point. And you need to have mentors who will understand how the establishment is going to react to your ideas. So they have to be people that are probably, as Michèle talked about, white men, for example, in some situations, who will hopefully, you'll be able to connect to some, and they will want to give you that kind of advice. The second is kind of more of a tactical point. You're someone with a different perspective, and you're probably full of ideas, observations that the national security or intelligence community needs to hear. Really important. The national security intelligence community doesn't need to hear all of them at the same time, right? You have these different ideas, you need to think about your ideas. This is not something I did. I learned this after, in hindsight. You need to think about these ideas and go, okay, I've got these 10 things that I really think need attention, but how many of my brilliant ideas can this organization tolerate? And I'll tell you, the answer is always not all of them. So you need to think, which idea or two can I advance this year? And then you have to have a method for thinking about choosing among your ideas. So often, your ideas that you have that are less heretical, less theological in nature, probably stand a better chance of gaining support. A third idea, and I wrote this down, I was reflecting on why I didn't speak up at that table and why I didn't say anything. And one reason why I didn't say anything is I didn't want to embarrass people. So you're here, you're in this meeting, people are talking about what they're going to do, and all of a sudden, I'm going to say something that is going to indirectly accuse them of being insensitive to the value of human life. That's kind of an embarrassing conversation. So I think that you need to think about a way of presenting these ideas that depersonalizes them and focuses on sort of the mission aspect of them and not what, the problem with the way they look at the world. And I think that requires a lot of thought and is the kind of thing that you can't do impulsively. Fourth, timing is everything. Find the right appropriate moment to make your point. And so, again, to get back to that sitting around the table, people were thinking about doing something that evening, for example, probably not, and they felt that it was urgent. So probably not the appropriate moment for me to say, hey, wait, have you thought about this? So I needed to step back. I needed to find, have a conversation with people who planned this and talk to them about, when you present this at a meeting, have you thought about giving a more complete picture of the consequences, for example? So when people are ready to act, and this is really true in the national security environment, it is one of the problems that the intelligence community has with serving policymakers. When you're about to act, the last thing you really need is someone's opinion, particularly if it doesn't really change your mind about what you're going to do. So you need to think about the timing. At what point in the policymaking process are you going to provide your ideas? A fifth thought, and it's important for everything you do in life, build allies, right? Don't do it by yourself. There's got to be other people in the organization who have the same concerns or nervousness or the same aspirations as you do. Find them. And one of the things that you should not succumb to is what Freud calls the, what is that word? The narcissism of small differences, right? Where you get a group of you have a common cause, common end vision, but what you do is you fight and you squabble over the details. If you're going to gain an effective alliance, the purity of your ideas, I believe, has to be compromised to gain the maximum amount of political support. I told you some of these were going to be controversial. And the final one that I'll say, and then I'm going to stop and take questions, but not from Peter. The last thing is always be aware if what you're suggesting, the kinds of different approaches you think are wise, are theological in nature. Because I'm not saying that you should not try to make theological change in organizations. In fact, my whole argument is that theological change is essential in the intelligence and community and national security because of this transformed world that we're in. But first figure out, make an estimation. Is what I'm talking about theological in nature? And if so, then proceed carefully, building alliances and trying to figure out a way to align at least some of what you're talking about with what the organization currently values. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to let you ask me whatever you want.
Great. Thank you so much, Carmen. Now for the fun part, and I will not ask questions unless everybody's completely silent. Carmen, you okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, good. So let me see, what do we got out here?
Great talk, Carmen. I thought
Thank you.
always fascinating, but really on target. And one of them brings up a pet peeve of mine, as Peter has heard before, and it is perhaps a theological change related partly to diversity, but more to the problem you mentioned, that intelligence organizations thrive on adversaries, and even more thrive on processing secret information. That's right, their general comparative advantage. If you argue, as many people have, and I think you're implicitly arguing some things, that now not as secret information isn't irrelevant, but the balance of importance between secrets and mysteries, what Janow and Greg Treverton have termed, things that like complexity are not going to be found in documents or SIGINT, but are important trends and that can best be understood through open sources. Now, I know the intelligence community has paid lip service to this in the open source center and stuff, but I wonder if you'd comment on how well you think the community is doing and what can be done if it isn't enough. And I'll just give one example. As Peter knows, about 10 dozen years ago, I had an assignment to look at the quality of intelligence on a particular difficult country in which we had an adversarial relation. And I asked the person in charge of the office, who was very good, about whether they used open sources at all, because this was not impossible. And she said, yes, they do. In fact, if you go, you'll see there's one area in our general bullpen, and that's where the open sources people work. And I would make it a point to walk by that area at least once or twice a day. Almost saw no one there. So anyway, the question is, how well are we doing with integrating open sources, and can you get a theological change? Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And thank you so much for caring about the intelligence community for all these many years. You've always been a great source of wisdom. No, we're not doing very well on this. And I do and have written on this topic spoken on it in other venues. I think, I think the key thing is, what's the world like today? Is it a world where decisions are made in smoke-filled rooms and people are, trying to keep all these secrets, and that's what's really going to come to bite the US? Or is it a world of big, sort of hard to get your arms around changes and social movements that are, and that's what's coming to bite the US? And I think 50 years ago, it was more the former, the world of smoke-filled rooms. And today, I think it's more the latter. It's not exclusively the latter, but it's much more the latter than it was 40, 50 years ago. And that is the non-elite world, right? The first scenario is the world of elites. And so that's where you need all these precise intelligence collection methods that purport to get you what the elites are thinking. But when it's big social movements and climate change and fast moving technologies, etc., that's not you know, you can't find, you know, your local neighborhood friendly elite and ask them, well, what do you think is going to happen next? Because she's not going to know, right? That's a world where you figure out what's going on based on, you know, information, indicators, money flows, all these things that secret collection methods don't give you much information or insight on, but that understanding and sort of immersing yourself in the world of information gives you some, you know, insight. It's a very difficult world. It's, you know, theologically a world that is not suited to the intelligence community strengths. And I strongly believe that the longer we take to make this transition, the more danger we are courting for the American people or for the world community as a whole.
Thanks, Carmen. Do I have any questions here? Please, Inbar.
Hi, my name is Inbar. I'm a staff member at the Saltzman Institute. So thank you so much for everything you said. It was really, really interesting and inspiring. You talked a lot about institutional tendencies, and you gave the example of sort of the CAA having an adversarial mindset, and talked about what change makers within an institution can do to sort of change that. My question is, how does what someone does within the institution interact with external factors such as sort of domestic public and the media landscape that might be like pull factors towards a certain way of thinking beyond just an institutional tendency?
Right. So I'm not exactly sure I've got your question, but let me say something that I realized with your answer that I forgot to mention in my talk. And this was an important point that I wanted to make, which has to do with the role of the CIA. And I think it gets to some of what you're asking. The role of the CIA and the intelligence community is to allow the policymaker to make the best decision she can. But in today's world, in today's changed information environment, the public has a vote and has much greater influence on the decisions that the policymaker is able to make. We see this very clearly with COVID. And so therefore, I believe in the future that the intelligence community can no longer just serve the elite government policymaker, that the intelligence community, and I know this is incredibly hard and very talking about way out there as an idea, but I think that the intelligence community has to find a way to engage with the public debate about issues. I have no idea how that would be done, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can just sort of remain this isolated actor just serving the elites in our government. So I don't think that quite got at your question. So ask me a follow on, you know, that makes it,
so
yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what I meant is, obviously there's institutional like thinking that's defining priorities within the CAA, but it's also the external policy environment. And that policy environment is affected by exactly what you said, sort of the public and the media and all of these narratives, as you were saying. And so I guess my question was, as a change maker trying to change how people are thinking within an institution, how do you sort of counter those outside variables that might be also impacting the way that the institution is?
Yeah, so right. So there's a big debate among people like me who think the intelligence community requires some real fundamental rethink about whether or not this change can occur, you know, internally driven, or whether we need to have a demand signal from the policymakers, from the customers we serve. And so far, the demand signal for a different type of intelligence just has not come from the policymakers. And I have to concede that, although I will say that I understand that more and more often policymakers are going to their favorite source of information when the intelligence community can't respond as quickly or as thoroughly as they want it to. You know, there's yeah, I'm still don't think I'm answering your question that well, but there's a naive way that the public thinks about national security and the intelligence community that does make it harder for people within the community to argue for reform. And a good example of that, you may all remember that video that came out, I think it was the recruitment video called Humans in the CIA. And I actually talked to the young woman who was featured in it. And here I think we're trying to do something correct. We are trying to humanize ourselves and prove that real people work at the CIA. And all these critics came out saying, oh, well, you know, you're feminizing the CIA, and no, there's no way that China and Russia are going to be scared of a CIA that's like this. I mean, just ridiculous stuff. And so you're right that kind of discussion makes it harder for internal change advocates to make progress. So how do you counter that? I don't know exactly how do you counter it other than to, you know, yeah. Peter, do you have an idea?
Actually, one of the points you made earlier about strategies,
Yes.
to me, well, at the risk of getting a little controversial, that video, I had very mixed feelings about it. And when I saw it, I thought, I know what they're trying to do here, but I thought they went quite a bit too far and they actually undermined the goal. And you said earlier, you need to pick your spots.
Yes.
You
yeah.
used the word nuance, finesse. I think that could have been nuanced way differently and had a much more powerful effect. And instead it generated this horrible controversy.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think it's hard because, you know, if you're in government, you can't really engage in the public debate. And that's what makes it really difficult, right? I can now say these crazy things because I'm no longer in government. But if you're a change advocate in government, you can't. So I would say that you probably need to cultivate friends like me and Peter, who are no longer in government, and encourage them to say the things that need to be said, to sort of balance the way CIA intelligence and national security are portrayed.
Carmen, if you will indulge me, we have about 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I want to share an anecdote. And Carmen, feel free to push back on this because I know I've asked you this before. Carmen talked about the challenge she faced in trying to bring about knowledge and appreciation and acceptance of the new world of IT and the digital world. And it was not easy. I totally am with you, Carmen. And I remember we had a conversation once and I was pretty old school. And you made a very powerful point, which is consistent with what you just said right now. She said, Peter, the amazing thing about the internet and all these voices that are now emerging on the internet is now we no longer have the monopoly of elite thinking. It's what you said. Everybody, we all read the New York Times and Foreign Affairs and all the key journals, and we all know how to think. But now, because of the internet, we have bloggers and people with a whole range of diverse views, which I completely agree with. But I remember at the time, I also made the point, but Carmen, we're the editors and reviewers. It's freaking me out that there are all these people out there who just say stuff. And guess what? Some of it isn't quite accurate as we see now. It's more than just not accurate. It's flat out wrong. And we're in this horribly politicized world now where I just cringe because there's so much information and everybody has a voice and everybody can say what they want. And nobody has an editor and reviewer who says, you can't say that.
And that is why I think, Peter, there's got to be some way, some role that the intelligence community can play or some educational function that national security creates that is authentic, which is a real obstacle that will balance the debate today. Because you're right, it's a wild west out there and there are no controls whatsoever. And we can tell, you know, first the experience of the coronavirus tells us that it's not just that people are making up these stories. It's that issues are so complex and nuanced that nothing is as clear cut as anybody says, which is what creates all this opportunity for confusion.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna have to stop here because I know some of you may have class at 2:10. Carmen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your being here today.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a joy to see you.